Welcome back. In an age of rising protectionism and nationalist sentiment, is multilateralism dead? Joining us now for this part of the program from New York, Sarah Cliff is the director of New York University's Center on International Cooperation. From Beijing, Victor Gao is vice president of the Center for China and Globalization, and John Sitilides is a global risk analyst and principal with Trilogy Advisors. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Sarah, let me start with you in New York. At last week's UN General Assembly meeting, President Trump rejected what he termed the ideology of globalism. He again talked of his America First policy and said the United States will not surrender what he called its sovereignty to unaccountable, unelected global bureaucracies. When you hear something like that, what does it tell you about the impact this is going to have on the whole idea of multilateralism and America's role in the world?
So this is very important. The US over the last period has withdrawn from several multilateral processes on climate change, on migration, at the Human Rights Council, defunding the UN operation in Palestine, and most recently announcing withdrawal from the International Court of Justice processes. So this is a signal from the country that hosts UN headquarters, that was there at its founding, that is damaging to our collective efforts to address problems. But at the same time, I think it's important to stress that the US has remained engaged in other aspects at the UN. It's remained engaged in supporting management reform and strengthening. It's remained largely engaged in peacekeeping. And also to stress that we have some collective failures here, not just the actions of the US administration. So the Security Council's failure to reach agreements that would halt the violence in Syria in recent years has really been a collective failure. And here I think it's important to stress that there is no contradiction between countries supporting their national interests and realizing that they have to reach global agreements. All countries bring their national interests to the UN. That's natural. But we also have a recognition that there are challenges like climate change, like pandemics, like the movements of migrants and refugees, that no country on its own can solve. So the UN there is the primary platform for reaching deals that can address issues that citizens worldwide are concerned about. And countries really need to put effort now, not into their divisions, but into those shared interests.
John, what is your view in this? How do you see the United States' role in the world? Is it at this stage looking too much after its own interests at the expense of, say, the global interest?
I think what President Trump laid out at the UN speech and what we've heard over the last year and a half, nearly 2 years now, is a much more honest foreign policy about the United States working not so much on a unilateralist basis on any particular issue, multilateralism where it makes sense to advance U.S. interests, and as he put it, patriotic, or as some critics might call it, a more nationalist approach, where it feels that the international framework isn't advancing U.S. interests. And the three primary issues there are on the climate change agreement, on the Iran nuclear agreement, and on the International Criminal Court. And on climate change, there's obviously a very strong philosophical disagreement between the administration and those who support the Paris Agreement. And one only need look at what happened over the last couple of years, where countries such as China, Germany, and other leading European powers and other major industrial countries have actually increased their carbon emissions while they can claim that they're signatories to Paris. The U.S. has withdrawn now under President Trump, while for 3 consecutive years the U.S. has reduced carbon emissions. So the administration's position is, when everyone is serious about joining the U.S. and moving in a proper direction together using technology and efficiencies and moving towards those types of energies that can help advance our objectives, let's do so. But not at the expense of the United States and the redistribution of trillions of dollars from the U.S. and Western economies to dictatorships and backwards economies, corrupt economies, for the sake of some 100-year-out objective.
Victor, you've heard that countries look after their own interests, their own national interests. China possibly does the same itself. But in this instance, when you look at the speech that Donald Trump made at the UN, when you look at what the UN has done, pulling out of major treaties, has it compromised the multilateral order?
Well, I personally sincerely hope President Donald Trump and his administration are aberrations from the United States, and eventually we will reach a period beyond Trump I think the United States can serve itself better and serve the world better if it is more engaged with the rest of the world. After all, for so many years and decades, the United States was looked up to as a beacon, as a light, for example, and people in many parts of the world actually wanted to share the aspirations of the United States. But now, under President Donald Trump, the United States is more and more withdrawing behind the protectionist walls. And this really erodes the so-called leadership of the United States. And this is a disappointment to the rest of the world. Therefore, I hope Trump will be an aberration, and eventually future administrations of the United States will do better things, and the United States can become a better member of the international community. In the world today, hiding behind national walls will not serve any constructive purpose. It may serve very short-term interests of that particular country, but in the longer term, it's self-destructive.
Sarah, you know, you made the point that countries do look after their own national interests, but when we look at some of the major global problems, things like climate change, things like human rights, the United States has pulled out of the Paris Accord. As John pointed out, it's pulled out of the International Criminal Court, it's pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, it's also pulled out of the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. Does it erode global efforts to combat these common problems?
So it certainly is a powerful signal, as I had said, that the home of UN headquarters, that we have this withdrawal from some of the important international processes on issues that citizens are most concerned about, from migration to climate change to inequality. But Stefan Dujarric made a very good point that there is still action going on at the subnational level and among business. So, for instance, you see US states, US municipalities, US business signing up to the climate change targets irrespective. And that, I think, is a powerful movement that we should not underestimate at this point. I do think, though, that it is crucially important that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, including the United States, recognize that many of these issues are not issues that they can solve on their own. So they have strong national interests in relation to them. They will need, of course, to defend those interests, but they also need to cooperate with others in order to deliver what their own citizens want to see.
John?
I think we need to be careful here to not frame this issue as a binary issue, that the U.S. is in one camp firmly and other countries around the world are in another camp, unilateralism versus multilateralism. In those areas where it's essential to cooperate with other countries, such as in dealing with the efforts to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, there's very much a multilateral effort. The United States, China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, on Ukraine and enforcing the Minsk Agreement, on trying to bring about conflict resolution in Syria, in dealing with the EU migration issue, which is not a European issue only, but also an African and Southwest Asian issue. We're working on multilateral fronts there where it's essential and where there's no other recourse. But on a number of issues where the United States is simply right now philosophically opposed to that of certain elites in other cities and other capitals around the world, there are going to be these disagreements. You mentioned the International Criminal Court, Anand. Well, that burden would largely fall on American soldiers that are doing the lion's share of the kind of aggressive war fighting against terrorism and against piracy in some of the most troubled parts of the world. But Bolivia is not under threat from the International Criminal Court. Neither is Belgium. And so we need to be very careful here. Those areas that are targeting the United States are going to be problematic in terms of the differences here, where the U.S. can work together to solve problems that need cooperation between countries. It's continuing to do so.
Victor, what do you make of John's point that multilateralism is not really dead? I mean, the sentiment from Donald Trump may point to the fact that it's being eroded, but if we look at the examples that he cited, Ukraine, North Korea, the refugee crisis in Europe, that countries are still cooperating.
Indeed, I think the megatrend in the world today is that the world is becoming smaller and smaller, becoming flatter and flatter, and the global village is a reality more and more so. And therefore, I think mankind as a whole need to think more about this integrated interests of mankind as a whole and coming up with global solutions of many problems that no single country in the world can single-handedly solve. And it really requires collective efforts, global efforts, and dealing with all these major threats to mankind as a whole. Therefore, I would say any country preaching and practicing unilateralism eventually will do itself a big harm and do mankind as a whole a big harm. And this is the time when we need to really pause and think about these megatrends, because we are living in a more and more integrated world. The internet is really accelerating all these changes, and there will be no national wall behind which we can hide as individual countries. Eventually, it will become more and more so as a global village, and we need to come up with global solutions.
Sarah, specifically on the United Nations and how it works, let's listen to part of what Donald Trump had to say.
We withdrew from the Human Rights Council, and we will not return until real reform is enacted. For similar reasons, the United States will provide no support and recognition to the International Criminal Court. As far as America is concerned, the ICC has no jurisdiction, no legitimacy, and no authority. The ICC claims near universal jurisdiction over the citizens of every country, violating all principles of justice, fairness, and due process. We will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy.
What is the sentiment that Donald Trump sends to the world there? What's the message that he sends, Sarah?
So we should remember also that this is in the year of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a declaration which the US, along with other countries, including China, Lebanon, many other countries, was involved in first setting up. And at that time, the founders of the UN's work on human rights recognized that in order to get other countries to comply with standards that respected rules, that respected the treatment of their own citizens, you had to have those standards be universal. Because you could not say to countries, you have to comply with this, but I am not going to comply. So there is a larger question of interest here. All countries are uncomfortable if they feel that they themselves are vulnerable to being a target
But Sarah,
of criticism.
isn't that what Donald Trump is saying here? He's saying that, you know, we reserve the right to criticize other countries where there may be violations of human rights, but where it affects us, well, we're not prepared to listen to that.
And there I believe that this is very much not in the US's long-term interest. So as with all parts of the UN, because this is an unwieldy body, it's made up of 193 member states, there are always opportunities to reform it and to strengthen it. But that is better done from within. If you withdraw, you do send this signal, which also provides an excuse for other countries to say, we do not necessarily need to cooperate.
John, the final word.
Well, I think one of the things that has been most problematic for the Trump administration in terms of the UN Human Rights Council is that its membership is increasingly comprised of some of the most notorious human rights abusing regimes in the world. So there's a credibility issue there. And remember, the administration didn't simply withdraw.
If that's a credibility issue, Saudi Arabia was a member of the Human Rights Council, and it's a close ally of the United States.
It still has very severe human rights problems, as does other countries with even more noxious human rights problems. But the administration made very clear to the UN, let's rethink the way the Human Rights Council should work. It wasn't simply a withdrawal, but there was no serious response. There was no effort at reform. And so it was after that long deliberative period that the administration finally withdrew, as they did with Iran, after they asked the Europeans to try to help build a stronger regime for non-proliferation. They failed to do so, and the administration withdrew.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.